So I watched Disney's most recent animated movie, Wish, a few days ago, and the internet has not been able to stop talking about it. People were really split down the middle with this one from the moment the trailers released, and the discourse only got more and more hostile once the negative reviews started to come in. And after actually watching the film, I can definitely understand why people are divided. So I'm gonna save my overall thoughts on this movie for later, but today I wanted to talk about one specific aspect that stood out to me, which coincidentally was the thing that I was most curious about going into it. I'm talking about the bad guy, the antagonist of the film, King Magnifico.
Keep the name, I'm magnificent. I put the eye and I'm omnipotent.
The reason why I was excited about this guy was the fact that he was marketed as a return to form for pure Disney villains, which is something the studio doesn't do much of nowadays. Everything about this guy had me intrigued. His powers, his ideology, his musical number. I was really interested in seeing how Disney was going to execute their first attempt at an explicitly evil antagonist in over a decade. And I wasn't the only one expressing these sentiments. People seemed very enthusiastic about the fact that this guy looked like he was going to operate in a similar manner to Disney's most iconic and classic Disney villains.
And my favorite movies are the ones that have those great villains that you know from the beginning.
With that being said, in my opinion, he was easily the most disappointing part of the movie for me. And it's weird because based on the interactions that I've seen on social media, it seems like I'm kind of in the minority on this. If we're talking exclusively about Chris Pine and his vocal performance, then yes, I do agree that he does a great job.
They want a villain, you got one. Brought to you by Chris Pine.
So I wanted to make this video to try and explain why he didn't work for me personally as an antagonist, and some general Disney villain commentary. In the opening of the film, we're narrated his backstory about how he became the King of Rosas. He studied sorcery and magic, which led to him gaining the power to grant wishes of his subjects. On each of their 18th birthdays, a ceremony is held where they give their wishes to him and he holds on to them, and he'll grant one of them once a month. But we find out that he's only willing to grant the wishes that he believes are best for Rosas. Also, the citizens forget their wishes once they give them to him. This is a setup that I think has a lot of potential. A dictator whose corrupted ideology makes him abuse the powers that he's been given, even though he has the trust of nearly everyone in the kingdom. Then we get to his official introduction scene, where we find out Asha's overly enthusiastic to work for him. And this ambitious but selfish antagonist is introduced as a nice guy. The reason why I was surprised by this was because the way the writers decided to frame it, Magnifico in-universe isn't just some morally evil guy. He's a twist villain. The only difference is that the audience knows that he's evil going into it, but he isn't established to be evil, and the characters initially don't know that. In fact, he has an entire duet with Asha that implies that he's well-intentioned in his desire to protect the wishes at all costs. I wasn't gonna automatically write this guy off because he was a twist villain though, as long as he still was well-written and had ample time to be nefarious. But then we get to the scene that occurs right afterwards. When Asha asks Magnifico if he'll grant her grandfather's wish since he's almost 100 years old and has been waiting for a long time, he says no, with his rationale being that it's too vague and he assumes that it could potentially lead to harm coming to Rosas' way. This leads to him finally telling her the truth about the wishes, and Asha pushes back before he says,
I decide what everyone deserves.
So this is getting really messy really fast. Alright, to explain what I mean by this, I'm gonna play you some actual lyrics from At All Costs.
If happiness was a tangible thing, it would be you. If you'd have told me the feeling you'd bring, I'd think it untrue.
These are very passionate lyrics, not necessarily romantic, but very intimate. Magnifico is shown to see something unique in Asha, whether it be because of his connections with her father, who was a philosopher, or her desire to secure the happiness and well-being of the citizens of Rosas. He says himself that she's one of the few people he's actually let see the wishes. But the minute she asks for a request, he goes from 0 to 100 in terms of his demeanor. I understand it's meant to be a betrayal and to sabotage any goodwill we have for this character, but we only get one scene with positive interactions from them before she finds out he's evil. It isn't very well paced. This has been a criticism that's been levied at many of the other twist villains from Disney throughout the 2010s, but here it's just as abrupt of a character shift as someone like Bellwether or Sideburns. The only difference is that he has more time to be evil. And that's not even taking the ending into account, but we'll come back to that later. Magnifico is going to be a completely mask-off antagonist for the remainder of the movie. He tells Asha that she can't have the job or her grandfather's wish, and he's going to do everything in his power to make sure that as few of them are as granted as possible. Why is that, though? Returning to the opening of the film, the rationale behind Magnifico's paranoia about granting the wishes of the citizens of Rosas is stated. He vaguely talks about the destruction of his old village and how learning magic could have allowed him to protect his family and his people. That isn't irrational by any means, but the movie doesn't do much to expand upon this idea beyond dialogue. It becomes harder to understand the logic behind his actions because we barely know the actions that led him to this point and made him have this line of thinking. That he always assumes the worst case scenario and overthinks people's relatively simple wishes. It could have easily been rectified if they just showed a flashback or had a clear explanation for what happened to him and his wife, but the movie doesn't do this. We're also not given very many other instances of seemingly harmless wishes that the king might overthink either. It's just something that the movie implies. Then we get to the aftermath of Asha making a wish upon the best character in the movie. Look at how adorable he is. Oh. At this point in the story, Magnifico is actively chasing after Asha for using magic in the kingdom without permission, where we get our first Disney villain song since Shiny.
I'd give the clothes off Benito's back.
I had a theory about this song when Disney released a sneak peek of it, and I wrote the following tweet as a response. Disney is either gonna redeem this man or have him gradually descend into madness like Gaston. Either way, he looks like he's gonna be the best part of the movie. I was half right, like he does gradually descend into a monster over the course of the movie. Okay, jokes aside though, it feels like this musical number is a major step backwards in terms of his progression into becoming more evil. Tonally, it doesn't really feel like a villain song either. It's very upbeat and doesn't read as sinister until the very end. Random general thought incoming, Julia Michaels was the wrong choice for this soundtrack. Since I compared this guy to Gaston, I'd like to use him as a frame of reference to explain my points. He has a very linear journey throughout the film, starting out as an egotistical bully who is beloved by the town before gradually becoming more sinister when he discovers the existence of the beast. And he also has a very upbeat and comedic villain song.
As you see, I've got biceps to spare.
Now I want you to imagine that this song plays right after Gaston locks Maurice up.
So you want me to throw her father into the asylum unless she agrees to marry you? Oh, that is despicable. I love it.
See, it wouldn't fit. That's how This Is the Thanks I Get is for me. It feels like it would have been better if they had decided to play it earlier in the film before he fully loses control. My theory was that this was going to show off his ego and entitlement to the trust of his subjects before we got to see his more nefarious nature. It comes across as off in the context of the film. There's no consistency in his progression. He goes back and forth between being calculating and irrational. It also plays a role in the Queen's loyalty to him before her redemptive arc. She mentions how she stayed with him for all this time because she knows he's well-intentioned and he has a softer and more compassionate side to him. But it's hard to buy either of those things since we don't see any positive interactions with them. You would think the person he started this journey alongside would stand by him, but you need a stronger justification for why now that his actions are this dangerous and self-destructive. I mean, listen to her lines in the song Knowing What I Know Now. What love are you referring to? We haven't seen that side of him that you claim to love so much.
I love you.
Liar!
This is the biggest factor as to why King Magnifico isn't a good villain for me. In isolation, I do think he is better as a violent rage monster than a misguided dictator, and I think that was intentional. It's why I think a lot of people like him so much. The whole idea of Wish is trying to add nuance to something as simple and innocent as wishing on a star, with him being the physical manifestation of the darker implications of that concept. What if someone's wishes are bad, and who's the one that gets to decide that? It would have been so cool to have gotten the best of both worlds with the character that's three-dimensional while also being a fun, entertaining threat. By the time we get to the climax though, he just uses forbidden magic and ends up devolving into a one-dimensional bloodthirsty monster whose only real reason for continuing to hold on to the wishes is the power that it gives him. His motivation becomes more simplistic and shallow as the movie goes on, with no resolve or reconciliation with why he's in this position in the first place. The contrast between where he starts and where he ends up isn't a believable transition. The creatives have gone on record saying that he's meant to emulate classic Disney villains, but when you take into account that his mindset and motivations have more depth and layers to them than most of those villains, a part of me thinks that he was made this way out of an obligation to fill a niche, irrespective of the character it was attached to. I do want to be clear that I'm happy that Disney was willing to give us a much more traditional villain, but even though it's their first attempt at it since arguably King Candy, it feels like they prioritized the aesthetics of him being evil and didn't utilize this concept to its fullest potential, which is why he personally didn't work for me. So that's most of what I have to say about that for now. I wanted to try something a little different from my typical review style, but I will be sure to share the rest of my thoughts on this movie in the 2023 animation ranking next month. I have a lot more to say about this movie, so stay tuned. Thanks for watching, Minnows, and I'll see you again at the edge of the water.